Let me say a pleasant good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to the first year seminar for 2022-2023 school year. My name is Ronnie Roberts, Dr. Ronnie Roberts. I am the graduate program coordinator of the School of Graduate Studies and Research. So I want to especially welcome all our, first years. There's a different term that they use, but I prefer first years who are here on campus with us. I also want to welcome those who are at our satellite sites. Welcome to you. And this evening, we certainly have a most fitting topic given our contemporary discussion of DEI. I don't know if you know what DEI stands for. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. But our topic this evening fits right within that mold, so to speak, for we will be discussing race, class, and ethnicity. And so we have two very au courant facilitators who will be talking with us this evening, Drs. Fiona Rajkumar and Terencia Joseph. And so at this point in time, I want to encourage you to listen carefully. If you have questions, feel free to jot those questions down. I understand that we do have our persons on YouTube, and so feel free to write that also in the YouTube chat, whatever questions that you have. At the end of the presentation, then we will entertain those questions. And so, again, we want to encourage your participation and your engagement. Beyond that, we hope that at the end of the presentations this evening, we will certainly have some thought transformation and, of course, some behavior change. And so without further ado, I want to give you a brief introduction of our presenters this evening, and I believe they will be coming in this order. Dr. Terencia Kenyatta Joseph is an associate professor in the Department of History and Social Studies at the University of the Southern Caribbean. She lectures in Caribbean, Latin American, and 19th and 20th century world history and women and gender history. Her primary research emphasis is St. Lucian history, with a focus on labor, women, children, and the environment. She is passionate about making Caribbean history more accessible and encouraging for everyone to actively participate in recording our very rich history. After Dr. Joseph speaks, then we will have a presentation by none other than Fiona Rajkumar. Dr. Fiona Rajkumar is an associate professor of history at the University of the Southern Caribbean. She has an undergraduate degree from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, which focused on history and literature. She also has an MA with distinction in history from UE as well. And in 2007, she completed a PhD in history, also conferred by the UE, St. Augustine. Dr. Rajkumar has been lecturing at the University of the Southern Caribbean for the past 15 years. At the undergraduate level, Dr. Rajkumar lectures in the areas of Caribbean history, Caribbean research, minority groups in the Caribbean, and graduate writing and research. She is the pioneer of the YES USC History and Mentorship Program, an initiative of the School of Education and Humanities, which focuses on working with secondary school students. Her areas of research interest include ethnic minorities, economic and migration history in the Caribbean, advocacy for history education, homeschooling, and youth mentorship in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. So without much further ado, I want to welcome at this time Dr. Joseph to speak to us. After that, she'll be followed by Dr. Rajkumar, and then we will have our question and answer session.
Good afternoon, everyone, especially those who are in person with us. I'm happy that we can have more presentations and seminars together. All right, so I'm going to be looking at definitions of social construct. So these are some of the words I will be mentioning over and over again: social construct, race, racism, ethnicity, social class, and implicit bias. These are all words you're familiar with? Yeah? All right. Okay, and after I look at that, I will go briefly into what the structure of Caribbean society looked like up to 1900. So what we are trying to do this afternoon is to help us understand the basis and the legacies of Caribbean history, which inform today the societies that we live in, the relationships which we have with each other. Okay, so hopefully you will become more sensitive to why you think in a certain way and why you see certain groups behaving and interacting in certain ways. So social construct, that is really telling us how we come up with certain ideas. A social construct is generally something that is created from our interactions with other humans, and together we decide that it exists or it's true. All right, so we can meet together and decide that certain things are true, and they don't have to be true, but we tell ourselves that they exist. So one of the things that we come together to decide is language. Okay, so if we think about language, you think of various languages. When you hear them, there's nothing in them that really tells us what they mean, the words mean. But because we've come together and decided that this thing we have that we're so connected to today, that we will call it a mobile phone, we have agreed to accept that that is the title for it, correct? All right? Beauty, although I don't know, I left out the B. Beauty is something that is also a social construct. So you'll have different people having ideas across time and across space. So people in different countries might decide what is a thing of beauty. So if we think in the Caribbean, what do we generally consider a beautiful woman or a beautiful man? It might differ than what we have in other places. Okay, so in certain societies, being very full-figured is considered beautiful, and in some societies, you will see that they are force-feeding young people to eat a lot, because for them, someone who is full-figured is considered healthy because they are well-fed. And that might be in a society where food might be lacking. And so people who are well-fed are seen as beautiful. In our context, we might be looking at different things to decide whether we consider an individual beautiful. I was asking students in a class last week, what are our concepts of beauty? And the first thing they said was Coca-Cola bottle shape. All right, so in the Caribbean, generally, we like to see on a woman hips. In another place, they might prefer to see something where you're more athletically built, yeah? And of course, when I ask about what do we consider as a handsome gentleman, then everyone kept quiet because, of course, the class was mostly girls. All right. So having spoken about social construct, we can go on to race. Race is a social construct. Often we want to think that race is biology, but that is really a fallacy. If we look at the world pre the arrival of African slaves in the Caribbean, for instance, even if we look at that period, if we look at the United States, there was not a concept of a white person. They spoke about ethnicities. They spoke about Germans. They spoke about Italians. They spoke about Englishmen versus Irishmen. And they spoke about Italians, but they didn't speak of a white individual. And it wasn't until slavery became very endemic in the Caribbean and in the United States, we start hearing more about a white individual as opposed to someone of a darker skin who is of African descent. And if we look at our censuses, excuse me, for instance, we will see over time the designations change. So I do my research on St. Lucia, and you would see a lot of mention of African, meaning Africans. So they were not even using initially black, white, that sort of thing. They were using nationalities. In Trinidad and Tobago, we use nationalities to designate races. So you'll speak of someone who's Indian, someone who's African. But where I'm from, St. Lucia, we will just use black or white. So for instance, when I was growing up in St. Lucia, and maybe it has changed a little bit now, anyone who was not white was black. So imagine my shock coming to Trinidad, and persons were referring to people of Indian descent and Chinese descent as Chinese and Indian and so on. For me, they were all black. All right? So within my context, that is what, how we contextualize race. So that is why we are saying race is a construct, a social construct, because there's nothing in the biology to really tell us if an individual is black, white, until we've agreed on it. Can we go back to the previous slide? Okay, I guess it's not playing, but here are different images, and generally we think about maybe someone who is blue-eyed would be what we call a white person, but here we have an image with someone who's very dark-skinned with what we call Afroid features, who has blue eyes. There was another image there, but we can't see it at the moment, with someone with slanted eyes. And generally we think of Asians, but this is someone from South Africa who has eyes shaped like that. So race is really something we come together and agree upon. And one of the reasons why race became a feature in our societies was to demonstrate power dynamics. That is the only reason race really has a hold in our society. So when we see people of a certain color, for instance, a certain race, we automatically fit them into a certain category. Okay, so if someone from the United States, for instance, were to come up here and speak, probably our initial response would be to actually listen, because we think that person is coming with a certain kind of education, maybe from a certain class. And you know, when I'm from an island where there's a lot of tourism, and when people see a person of European descent, they automatically think that these persons have money, yeah? Not understanding that some of them have the same types of jobs and had to do the same types of savings, because in our world, persons of that complexion are generally at the top of the society in certain positions, having a certain amount of power. All right? I always tell the students, when I went to the UK to do research for my PhD. And while I was at the archives, the National Archives in the UK, I was there as if I was at a job. I'd get there for 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock they'd open their doors, 12 o'clock I'd have my lunch, I come back. And so I remember the first 2 days I went to the bathroom and there was this woman there wiping down the sink, and I'm telling myself, oh my goodness, she must have opened the tap and all the water just splashed, so that's why she's wiping down the sink. The second day I come, about the same time, and the woman is there doing the same thing. I'm like, she made the same error twice. Anyway, I didn't really make anything of it. The third day, I saw her doing the same thing, and then I realized, oh my goodness, she must be the cleaner. But in my world, a cleaner is not of that complexion. And I was already in my late 20s when that happened. And so you see, we associate certain people who look a certain way with certain jobs, with certain positions of power based on our context. And we have come to agree that these are what these things mean. And we say that a certain race has this position because this is our reality now. But anybody of any complexion can be rich, can be intelligent, can be miserable, can be kind. It is not based on race. All right? So let's move on to racism. In the study of history, we have come to recognize that racism really became a construct with sugar production in the Caribbean region. And so when we talk about racism, we are referring to the prejudice that individuals have, which causes them to discriminate against someone of a different race, okay, which is a social construct. And based on the assumption of that individual's race, we place them either in a superior position or inferior, depending on what side of the color spectrum you're on. And the power given to one particular group then reverberates within the society in the politics, in the economy, and we base our behavior on the color. And so we see within Caribbean society, racism became a very significant thing. And we'll see that in a while, how Caribbean society is based on race and color. And so because of the development of racism, we began to see that certain behaviors by certain groups were considered good, and when performed by others, bad. And we use the race to deny certain groups certain opportunities and opened up opportunities for others. Yeah? And so growing up, and maybe even today, wherever you are in the Caribbean, you may still see vestiges of this. So certain positions, we will see particular races are in those positions, or maybe living in a particular area or holding certain jobs. Okay, another construct which is very close to racism or race is ethnicity. Okay, do you know the difference between race and ethnicity? Anybody? The difference between race and ethnicity. Okay, so she's saying one you're born with, that means your features, and one is cultural. Okay, very good, thank you. So yes, so ethnicity generally refers to cultural traits. So for instance, we might speak of being a Spanish speaker, we may speak of being Hindu, we may speak of being, what's another, from Trinidad and Tobago, a nationality. Okay, so in Trinidad and Tobago, you might be a Trinbagonian. However, you may be a Trinbagonian of European descent, of Indian descent, of Chinese descent, which are really ethnicities also, because you can have an Indian who is of African descent. Do you agree with that? Someone living in India, was born in India, of any race in the Caribbean can be considered a Trinidadian, a Jamaican, a Virgin Islander. Yes? All right. So that's another social construct. You can have an Indian who's Muslim and an Indian who is Hindu. So they are of the same race, but their ethnicities might be different. And of course, ethnicity is fluid. Because if you are Trinidadian, you can also be a different type of ethnicity within your ethnicity of being a Trinidadian or Tobagonian. Yeah? So social class. That is another social construct also. This one is based on your social status and your economic position and probably your political positioning also. And social class is often pegged on the schools you went to or the type of education you received, the place that you grew up in. So it might be a geographic location. Okay, some places it's urban versus rural. So often we think of persons from the urban area as being often in a higher social class, but we also recognize that there are many people in the urban areas who are very low social class and probably on the same level with someone who's in a rural area. But you have other places where people who live in more rural areas are considered the richer, the more affluent individuals. So you see how these things are social constructs. But we create those things also to determine the amount of power people within the society have. And so if I were to make a phone call, maybe to a hospital requiring a certain service, and I said, this is Terencia Joseph speaking, I will definitely get less attention than if I said, this is Dr. Joseph speaking, correct? All right, and why should I get more attention because I have DR in front of my name? It's only because we have made those decisions that people with that kind of education, that kind of background, should be given more. And really, when we think about those things, is that fair? Okay, so what we are talking about here this afternoon is to help you to begin questioning those things and maybe questioning how you treat others and how others treat you. Maybe just by watching you and seeing your face, your race, or maybe looking at the car that you pulled up in or that you did not pull up in a car. Okay, and this one here, implicit or unconscious bias. And I'm going to read the text. Implicit or unconscious bias are the underlying attitudes and stereotypes that people unconsciously attribute to another person or group of people that affect how they understand and engage with a person or group. Okay, so I am guilty of having implicit biases, but having a bias is not necessarily an incorrect thing, a wrong thing, a morally wrong thing. It is good to have acknowledged that you have a bias, because that will help you work around it and recognize when you're using it. The first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Eric Williams, who was consequently a historian, with a PhD in history. So all of you are wondering, what can you do with a history degree? You can become the first prime minister. Anyway, he recognized that he had a bias towards Caribbean history and Caribbean people. And he acknowledged that he was going to write a book on the history of the Caribbean, because at the time, many of the Caribbean countries were moving towards independence. And many of the books that we had on Caribbean history were written by old white European men who did not live in the Caribbean. And so what they were writing about Caribbean people was from their ethnic positioning, yeah? And so often if they were writing about slavery or indentured labor, they only spoke about these people as unit of productions, only as their ability to work. And so Eric Williams said that he was going to write a history text from the perspective of a Caribbean person. So that was his bias. He acknowledged it, and he wrote a book which we all appreciate. So it's okay to have biases, but we must acknowledge that we have it. What are some of the biases that we have? Implicit bias. Anyone in the audience? What are some of the implicit biases that we have? Okay, let me give you one. Men are from Mars and women are from Venus. What kind of bias is that? A gender bias. What about, you hear people saying, older people saying, when I was your age, we didn't behave like that. Or y'all have it so good. What bias is that? Age. So ageism. So you can have it both ways. You can have old people and young people. So you're walking on a street and somebody elderly is walking in front of you and they can't walk fast enough. Or what you're wearing. Mm-hmm. Yes. All right, so Ms. Ellis identified many of the everyday incidents that demonstrate our implicit biases. And so we really need to think about what we may have as biases and how that affects the relationships that we have with people. Yeah? So this story here, I want you to read it and tell me, do you understand it? So read it to yourself. Can we go back to the previous slide? Yes, thank you. Oh, no, go forward. Okay, does this story make sense to you? No? It makes sense. So one semester I put this up on the board and I asked the students to explain. And some students said, oh, miss, some is an outside child, is a Horner man. I was like, how you reach all there? And so the implicit bias is that when we see the word doctor, we automatically think of a man. And so when we read the story and we see that the doctor, you see, look at the reaction in the back there. So it really didn't make sense to you, right? You could not understand how the boy was with his father, and yet this other person is saying, this is my son, because the surgeon was the mother. All right? And I mean, all of us have this. And I remember some time ago, I was reading something about a carpenter, and I had to read the story over and over again because I saw the carpenter, and of course, in my mind, it's a man. but the carpenter was a woman. And I'm telling you, I read the story like 3 times and then went, okay. All right? So just a little bit about Caribbean society and structure. Excuse me, Alex? Will this one play as a PowerPoint? Because I need the images to come on separately, the one after this one. So Caribbean society is based, oh, sorry, the one after Caribbean society in 1800, the one after that one. So right, the one after it. So Caribbean society is based on race and color. And this began from the time of European presence in the Caribbean, but intensified with the introduction of enslaved Africans. We can describe Caribbean social structure up to 1900 as caste-like. I think you might be familiar with what the caste system is, which was a system which existed in India but was transformed greatly under British colonialism, where it was almost impossible for an individual to be upwardly mobile, move from one caste, from the lower caste to an upper caste. And because Caribbean society was based on color, and it's very difficult to change your color, you're kind of stuck in that position if your color determines the class that you are in. Okay, so the next slide, please. I needed to just go one at a time. All right, so just one more click. All right, so Caribbean society initially started with the early migration of the indigenous people to the Caribbean, yeah? I think some of you in your first year, you probably just covered that or began covering it in your Caribbean, in your West Indian history. So the indigenous people, or the first peoples, migrated into the Caribbean up from about 500 to 300 years BC. And later in 1492, Europeans began to consistently enter the Caribbean region, firstly led by Christopher Columbus. Next. All right, so these Europeans enter the region. Initially you had British, well, Columbus himself was Italian, but he represented the Spanish crown. And then we had the British, the French, the Dutch, and so on coming in to the society. Next. But with the arrival of Europeans, the first people saw a decimation of their population. So there was a huge decrease in the indigenous population. And they would reappear still within the society, but no longer the people who were in charge of the society, and the Europeans are going to become the conquerors, the persons who owned the means of production, the land, labor, capital. Next. And they would introduce Africans to provide the labor force on sugar estates, but also on cocoa, coffee, indigo estates. And they were brought in large numbers. Europeans came in much smaller numbers in the Caribbean region than people of African descent. And so over the period of 200-300 years, over 10 million people of African descent were introduced into the Americas as enslaved persons. Next. When during this period, you had a group of individuals who were referred to as free-coloreds. They were generally of African descent, but there were also some of the indigenous people also became part of that population. And there were also people of European descent, but they generally mixed. They were offspring of people of African and European descent, or European and indigenous. And they were referred to as mulatto, as mestizo, quadroons, a whole set of designations. And so they formed another group in the society during this period when African enslaved labor was introduced. So these people were allowed to be free, but they were not given all the civil rights as the Europeans. The Africans who came as enslaved persons were denied civil rights because they were considered chattel, that is private property. All right? Okay, next slide. Later, when enslavement ended, so when slavery was abolished, and the newly freed Africans were not satisfied to work for the very low wages that were being offered on the estates. The planter class, that is the people who owned the estates and plantations, decided to get other workers to come into the Caribbean. And let me explain to you, when I say that the Africans were not willing to work, they worked, they did work for the low wages, but let me tell you, make you understand what the wages were like. From 1838, when slavery ended, to the 1930s. So 1838 to the 1930s is 100 years, right? From that period, 1838 to the 1930s, if you were a laborer on a sugar estate, your wage was 1 shilling 6 pence in Trinidad for that whole 100 years. Can you imagine what the unions would be saying? So what it meant was that you were actually working for less than your grandparent by the time you came along. Yeah? And during that period, there were a lot of slumps in the sugar industry, so wages went down. They may have come up again to that 1 shilling 6 pence, which is about maybe 28 cents a day. So you could understand why people were trying to get other things to work for, right? And the only reason why Indians and Chinese ended up working for the entire period and later on for that money was because there was a contract that they signed. So they couldn't ask for higher wages. Okay, next. During that period, Portuguese and German indentured laborers were also introduced. And they were introduced in the society deliberately to create a white middle class. Okay, the planter class was very small. When they looked at the Africans and the non-white populations below them, they recognized that these people, because of their numbers, may sooner or later start to gain more power. And so they decided to bring in some Germans and some Portuguese and some Frenchmen to create a white middle class to make sure that the Indians and the Africans below them would not be able to fill the position of middle class. So if we look at this image, this structure of Caribbean society, now please, because I have Africans right at the bottom, it doesn't mean that Indians and Chinese were seen as better than them. It was just that when I was creating the slides to show when they were entering the society, this happened, all right? But when we look at this, what I want you to recognize is that the lighter the complexion, and I tried to get close to the complexions, the lighter complexions are further up on the social pyramid, and as you go down, it gets darker. What that also means is that the higher you go up, the more power, the more economic freedom, the more political power you have, the more social status. And as you go down and it gets darker, the less that you have. So Caribbean society was based on race and color, and depending on what you look like physically, you also knew what your position in the society was. So there were people of African descent and Indian descent and Chinese descent who were able to climb the social ladder and sometimes be at the top, before 1900, but they were generally in the minority. And the furthest that many of them were able to go was the middle class. All right, so I end here. Thank you. I guess I'll turn over to Dr. Rajkumar, but save your questions for after, and I will respond.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. You're hearing me clearly? Yes? So I will start with, it's not a joke really, but maybe a funny example of what Dr. Joseph would have spoken about. So I too initially got caught with this story, right? But it also reminds me of my own story. Because when people hear my name, they don't think me, very rarely. And I remember when I first started teaching in the USC, 15 years ago, 16 years ago, I had a student, and so I had just gotten my PhD. And she was a young lady of Indian descent. And so she was supposed to have been in my class, but she was looking for Dr. Rajkumar. And she kept walking up and down outside of my class, and well, she never came in. And so after class, apparently somebody probably pointed out who Dr. Rajkumar was to her. And so she came to my office, and she was so embarrassed and apologetic. So I just broke down in laughter, and that just cleared the air. Because she said, "Miss, I am so sorry. I really was looking for an Indian man," right? She wasn't even looking for an Indian lady. So that's why she felt so thrown. She really was looking for an Indian man. So the name completely threw her off, right? Because she just heard Dr. Rajkumar. If she had heard Fiona, she might have stopped and said, "Miss, are you Dr. Rajkumar?" Right? And so the way that we construct, as Dr. Rajkumar said, the way we come, that's Dr. Joseph said, the way that we come together to construct meaning in our societies is very important. So what I will do, I am looking at a similar time period, but going into the 20th century as Dr. Joseph, but looking at it from, so I don't have a presentation, so you will have to listen, right? But looking at it a little more from an economic perspective, right? And looking at what is called social mobility. And so mobility has to do with your ability to move upwards or downwards in a society, right? And even as I go through the presentation, you can even think about us now and the implications of what I'm speaking about for how far we've come as a society, right? I mean, even looking at this room, we can see that we have come very far, because the majority of you in the room, I'm not sure on YouTube, are women. Well, all of you are women, right? Where's the young man? Where him? Oh God, sorry. Sorry, good. So we have, hello. We have one young man, but the majority are young women, right? And we also have young women of African descent as well, okay? So 100 years ago, in a classroom or a university, the composition would have been very different, okay? So something to think about. So the white elite, and so Dr. Joseph spoke about when she looked at the pyramid. If the pyramid could stay, that would be great from Dr. Joseph's presentation, right? I don't know if Alex, are you able to pull up the pyramid that Dr. Joseph had? The last thing that she had in terms of the social pyramid. So at least that would be in our minds as we think about it, right? And so Dr. Joseph spoke about the indigenous people, and then she spoke about the Europeans coming to our region, right? And so this is 101 in terms of West Indian history. So we know that the main reason, one of the main reasons of the Europeans for moving outside of their jurisdiction would be economic reasons, okay? And so when they came to our part of the world, they didn't find exactly what they were looking for, but they found ways to exploit the Caribbean region for their economic purposes. And so that's really important for you to understand, because over time they were able to entrench themselves. They became those who controlled power in Caribbean society and economy, okay? So, same groups that Dr. Joseph have up there, the Spanish, the British, the French, the Dutch, right? Those were the groups who initially came, the Danes and eventually the Jews. And so they controlled sugar, cocoa, okay? They entrenched themselves in commerce, money lending, light industry, the professions, and the civil service across the Caribbean. So they were at the top of the society. And they continued to control the society and the economy. And so they were the ones. Remember, Dr. Joseph talked about the fact that social construct, you have people coming together to determine what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and what we will follow as a society. And so after the drastic decline of the indigenous people, they had no seat at the table to say what would be acceptable, right? And so the Europeans who came here for economic purposes were the ones who set up what would be acceptable and not acceptable. And then based on that, they brought in other groups of people to work on the economic ideas that they had, which were meant to benefit them. Is everybody following me so far? So what I'm looking at, from the perspective I'm looking at, we're looking at the construction of Caribbean society, right? And so Caribbean colonies were created to generate wealth for countries that were outside of the Caribbean. The resources of the colonies were not meant to develop the colonies. And after emancipation, the various groups that Dr. Joseph mentioned, like the Asians, the Indians, the Chinese, the Javanese, were brought here to work on Caribbean plantations, also including the European middle-class group, like the Portuguese, the Germans, and other French people. And so what you see happening is that they began constructing a society with them at the top. They would determine who would be at the middle and who would be at the bottom, all right? What also happened would be a sense of tension and conflict between the other groups who were brought in, all right, to work on the plantations. So for instance, throughout the 19th and into the 20th century, you had ethnic tensions and ethnic conflict between Africans and Portuguese, between Chinese and Africans, between Indians and Africans, because of where they were located in the society and because of the feeling that you couldn't progress beyond a certain level in the society. And so that caused conflict for those who were under the European groups. It's commonly called a sort of divide and conquer mentality. All right? And so persons were not groups, ethnic groups were not getting together to challenge the minority group at the top, which was a small group, okay? Because the minority group at the top, they were the ones with the power. Are you all following so far? Yes? Okay, wonderful. And so in the 19th century, the 1800s, race, ethnicity, what you look like, your color, your socio-economic position, which, right, where you are placed on the social strata, your national origin, right, where you came from was also important. So for instance, one of the things you would learn in West Indian history is that even though you had Europeans or Europeans and European descended people, even within that group they had conflict and challenges as well. Okay? So a European person who was born in the Caribbean, sometimes called a white Creole, Creole meaning at that time born in a region, as opposed to a European person who was born in England or France, there was a difference between them. The European person born outside of the region was placed higher. So even within those groups, you had hierarchies, okay? Who was seen at the top and who was seen at the bottom. And so what you see being created in the Caribbean was a very, what you call, stratified society. Many different levels, okay? And so all of those, in terms of the designations, were derived from European ideologies. And so every ethnic group that was brought into the country, the closer you came to European standards, the higher you were located on, or sort of on that pyramid, right, or in that pyramid. And so one of the groups, and so I'm just going to give you a couple examples to show, and then we're going to go into the 20th century to see the extent to which this has continued and the extent to which it has not continued. And so if we were to look at the Portuguese, right? The Portuguese were one of the first groups to be brought in formally as indentured laborers to work on plantations after emancipation. Now, not necessarily sugar plantations, cocoa plantations, but some of them were placed on sugar plantations to work with disastrous impact, right? Now, when you think somebody of Portuguese descent, what do you think about? Do you think light-colored, flowing hair? Dr. Joseph gave the example of the Caucasian person at the National Archives? Right? The British Archives, right? The British National Archives, cleaning the bathroom, and it took a few days for it to dawn upon her that that person was the janitor, the cleaner, right? Because in our context, that's not how it works, right? In the Caribbean. And so when you think of a person who is of Portuguese descent now, you don't think of somebody who may be in like a type of janitorial position or working on some farmland somewhere, right? But when Portuguese people came to Trinidad, that's what they came to do. They came to work on farms, right? Work on sugar estates, to do work that was very similar to what people of African descent who were enslaved did. And so that's what they did. And so even though they were European in nationality, in terms of social status, they were not seen as white or the elite. Can you all understand that? Because so I'm showing how their economics impacted where they were located on, in terms of social structure, right? And so what happened with the Portuguese, though? As Dr. Joseph rightly said, it was hoped that they would form a middle group. So they wouldn't have the same status as the other Europeans, but they could form a middle group as a buffer between the elite whites and the non-white groups. But what happened with the Portuguese? Over time, and it happened in the 20th century as well, over time, as they moved away from the plantations, they went into other kinds of jobs. Many of them continued in agriculture, but as they accumulated finances, they began to purchase shops. So they were some of the, well, I would say not first, because people of African descent were actually some of the first set of shopkeepers, right? But they too had shops. But who they were in terms of the Portuguese and why the Europeans brought them to the Caribbean impacted their ability to get into business in ways that people of African descent were not able to get into business. So Europeans granted license to be able to open liquor businesses and other kinds of businesses to Portuguese people. The majority of Portuguese people went to British Guyana, and so those kinds of accounts are very popular there. But it was the same in Trinidad. The Portuguese people who were in Trinidad, they also found favor. And so they were able to start businesses and to go beyond the people of African descent who had started businesses because of the kinds of favors they received because of why they were brought to the Caribbean. Are you able to follow that? And so if we were to go back to stereotypes, when I did my PhD looked at ethnicity and economic prosperity. And I did that thesis because there were a lot of ideas about why people particularly Trinidad and Tobago, my study was on Trinidad and Tobago, why people were in certain jobs in Trinidad and Tobago. And so I heard certain stereotypes like black people not good at business at all. That's why they're not in business, right? They can't manage money and all of those things, right? Chinese people, yeah, they're good at business, right? White people, they're good at business. Indian people, they're good at business. Black people, no. And so I started thinking about it, and I'm like, logically, that doesn't make sense. In terms of logically, having an inherent ability to just be, one group is just good at business and one group is just not good at business, didn't make sense to me. I felt as though, especially as a student of history, there had to be something deeper to that in our context, and I wanted to see, well, what that was, okay? And so in digging, then I began to find information like that. Like when our society was being set up in certain ways, you had different groups who were able to benefit from the structures that existed. And so that sort of gave them a head start, okay? Another challenge would be the ideas that the stereotypes, right? We talked about implicit biases. The ideas that the Europeans had of the different groups of people became the collective ideas of Caribbean society. So for instance, black people may be lazy. They're not smart, okay? Chinese people were naturally, and these are some of the ideas that were told, right? It's said, written down in documents. They're lazy, they're indolent, you know, they're not intellectually able, and I'm being very euphemistic with my language, right? Sometimes they were portrayed as children, okay? Their intellectual capacity was seen as being that of children instead. Chinese people were seen as being naturally industrious. That's why they were brought, and so that they could be, and it's said in a document, they could be an example to the indolent African people to cause them to work harder. And so you had all of these ideas that existed that became a part of how groups perceived each other. Indians were seen as thrifty, stingy, not trustworthy, alcoholic, right? And some of those stereotypes have continued to persist today, and we continue to speak some of these stereotypes, even if sometimes we may see differently, okay? Our ideologies, what we think, may sometimes trump what we may see in front of us. I remember once when I was graduating, I think it was my PhD when we graduated, a young girl came up to me and she was telling me how proud she was of me as a young black woman getting a PhD, right? And so she was getting a master's. And there were quite a few people of African descent graduating. I'm like, open your eyes and look around you. Look at you. Look around you. Because she continued to perpetuate that stereotype that people of African descent didn't really value education. And so the stereotype was in her mind, even though she didn't follow the stereotype. Her family didn't, and many of the graduates around her didn't either. And so she's like, oh my goodness. And so she apologized, and we talked a little bit after, right? And we talked about some of these things, because of course, this was the PhD I freshly graduated with, so lots of information was in my head for me to download to her. And so important to note, again, that the ideologies of the Europeans at the time constructed our society and placed people at different levels. So what happens? Groups like the Chinese and the Portuguese, after they moved away from the plantation, right? So they're no longer working on plantations, but because in phenotype, they were closer to white, they gained certain kinds of benefits that allowed them to move higher than people of African and Indian descent, okay, in the colonies. And then what Portuguese and Chinese people also did is that they negotiated their ethnicity. And so we got a definition of ethnicity in terms of, you know, certain kinds of traits and culture and all that. Your language, your religion, all of those things encompass your ethnicity. And so the Portuguese and the Chinese found ways to use their ethnicity to benefit them. And so what they did, many of them discarded their language. So Portuguese and their Chinese languages, they stopped talking and they tried to learn as much English as possible to help them interact with the wider society, right? But their children, they ensured that their children could speak English so that their children could not just go to school, but they could send their children abroad to university, okay? And so what happened with the Portuguese in particular? Now remind me, what nationality were the Portuguese? European descendants, right? They were European, okay? What phenotype were the Portuguese? European as well. And so what happened with the Portuguese is that over time, as they discarded those aspects of their ethnicity that tied them closer to African people, peasant, estate, farm type people, they were actually able to move into the white elite because they discarded those aspects of their identity that made them stand out. Can you all understand that? So now it's almost as though they were able, 2 and 3 generations after, to reclaim their white identity. Now, no other group in the society was able to do that. The Chinese couldn't do it because they were clearly not white by phenotype. So they got to a certain ceiling. right? Indians couldn't do it, and black or mixed people couldn't do it either. And so when you get to the 20th century and you look at the census reports where you're looking at how different people are described, you will see that after the 1960s, Portuguese as a designation in the census disappears. It's no longer existing, okay? Because the poor people who were Portuguese, they were now either absorbed into the white group, and so when the census reports were being taken, they identified themselves as white. They didn't identify themselves as Portuguese anymore, because they could do that now, right? And there were no distinguishing factors, no language, nothing, right? And so in that way, discarding their ethnicity, certain aspects of their ethnicity helped them. And some of them, of course, went into the mixed category because there are lots of Portuguese who also intermarried with black people, Indian people. And so in that way as well, they were no longer Portuguese, right? So they became either mixed or they became white, right? And so that shows how, again, ethnicity is a construct, right? It can exist or not exist. So let's get into the 20th century to wrap up the presentation. So by the time we get into the 20th century, so Dr. Joseph left us at the end of the 1900s. We're getting into the 20th century now, so the 1900s, right? She left us at the end of the 1800s. By the 1930s, many of the African and Indian people continued to be poor laborers. And as she pointed out, the wages that persons of Indian and African descent got were not good, all right? And so members of these two groups remained sort of the majority of those who were seen as at a lower status, right? There was limited access to education for poor people in the Caribbean, as the fees for school were high, and there were a limited number of schools in the Caribbean. And when I mean schools, I mean secondary schools that you could attend. Okay, this is before independence. And so the only way that you could get to a secondary school, if you were a poor person, was by getting a scholarship. If not, you had to pay. All right, you had to win an exhibition, which was like a scholarship to move from primary to secondary, to be able to actually go to secondary school. Now, I'm sure you all can't conceive having to get a scholarship to go to secondary school, because most of you all should have gone freely to secondary school, not so? Yes? Yes. And so sometimes what we take for granted as our reality, 100 years before, if we were born, none of us probably would have gotten to secondary school, right? Especially not the girls. Because back then, if you had any little money as a poorer person, you would educate your boys at all levels, right? No matter what ethnic group you belong to. So that's a whole different story. That's one of Dr. Joseph's gender class, right? And so there was limited access to education. So employment, unemployment high, wages low, people were discriminated against. By the 1940s, you had more Chinese, Portuguese, and now we have Syrian Lebanese people. And of course, I'm sure you know the Syrian Lebanese, at least in the context of Trinidad, right? Syrian Lebanese people coming into the Caribbean, but they didn't come to work on plantations. They came as migrants. On their way, some of them to the US, but many stayed in the different Caribbean islands, Jamaica, Trinidad, Haiti, and they made a home here, all right? And similarly to the Portuguese, many of them entered business, right? And now, if we think about it, and not think about it, but the stereotype would say that many of them were business people. Why? Because they are good at it. That's what we think, right? We think that people of Syrian Lebanese descent are just naturally good at business. But when you look at when they came and the time that they started coming into the region, between the 1910s onward, many of them couldn't speak English, right? Not very well off. And so they couldn't fit neatly into a middle class because they were not educated, at least not at the level of what we would consider, well, what was considered educated back then. And so many of them became what you call peddlers. I don't know if you know what a peddler is. You ever heard the term peddler? No? Yes? Yeah, so they would have the big bags, and they'd have clothes and different things, so the woman would sew. It's just like, what? And the woman would sew, make little shirts and stuff, and the men would have these bags, and they would walk around and they would sell. That's what they did. Okay, they would sell clothes. Anything they had, they would sell. And because they had no choice, that's all they could do. All right? Aside from farming, and they didn't go into farming. And so what you found is that little by little, those selling shirts became into selling shirts on a larger scale. And so you had some of the garment factories that are still owned by Syrian Lebanese people becoming businesses. So places like Januras. Any other businesses you all know? Eventually the cloth stores, right? Jimmy Aboods, right? And so when you look at how they would have evolved, a lot of it had to do with the context that they came into and what they had to do to survive in the context. Not that they were inherently good at business. And so again, a challenge to a stereotype, okay? A wonderful example, and I'll end with this, even though it's not all I would have wanted to say, but I want to end with this. A wonderful example I found in my research was comparing Chinese people in Jamaica and Trinidad to Chinese people in Guyana, okay? And in Jamaica and Trinidad, because at the time, when you're looking at the beginning of the 20th century, there were similarities in terms of what you call the trajectory, the economic journey of the Chinese in Trinidad and Jamaica, right? They also went into shops and businesses, gained favor, right? And were able to set up and become, part of commerce. And so again, in Trinidad and Jamaica, many Chinese people became business owners. In British Guyana, however, it was the Portuguese that did that. And as a larger number, they squeezed the Chinese out. And so many of the Chinese people in Jamaica never really became successful business people. They continued to work on plantations and they did regular jobs, okay? And the article that I looked at was called To Be or Not to Be Chinese. And it looked at the negotiation of ethnicity and what it meant to be Chinese, right? And how the Chinese people used their ethnicity or discarded their ethnicity to be able to help them to move economically in the society, right? And so to conclude, if we're looking at Caribbean societies are pretty complex because of, and to remember, if I want you to remember nothing, our societies were created, right? And we were created initially to provide wealth to outside nations. So we, in some ways, were an economic construct. And some of those economic issues and the ideas that the Europeans brought with them and entrenched here, we continue to struggle with those ideas. Okay? So even when elections time come around and budgeting comes around and we talk about, can we diversify, can we not diversify? That goes back to when we had sugar as a monocrop. That was our main form of, the kind of income. Then it went to oil and gas. And so agriculture struggles and continues to struggle because we still have a plantation, when you do sociology, plantation type lens that we look at our economy through. Okay? One good thing that has happened, however, is education. And we have our first Prime Minister, historian, Dr. Eric Williams, to thank for that. Because with all his many flaws and issues, one of the things he felt could change Caribbean societies and change the dynamic of Caribbean societies was education. And so what we have now, even though we still have some of the inequities and legacies that came with Caribbean enslavement, what we have are opportunities as well that young people in the audience have taken. And so you are now able to do what, similarly to him, to become the Prime Minister. You are able to hold a position of power because education affords you that. So we may still be discriminated on based on skin color, hair texture, or how your nose look, how your hair look, what kind of car you drive. But if you are willing to allow yourself to take all of the fairly free, accessible educational opportunities that you have, unlike our ancestors 100 years ago, we may not be able to break in to the white elite, but we are able to break into other kinds of elites that have been created, like the political elite to some extent. Okay? So I'll end there, and if you have any questions, we'll answer.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know how much time we do have for questions, but let's see what we have. Is there anyone with a question? Come on. There must be something that Oh, go ahead.
How were our early leaders, like Dr. William Manley, yes, how were the fathers of our nations trying to address this situation that you have described, if they were aware of it? And what would you say is the level of success they achieved in addressing it?
You know, one of the questions that's often addressed around independence or when we're going through a very economically challenging time is, should we have remained British or French colonies and so on? And that question, I think, feeds into what you are asking. And they did recognize that. And when we see the Caribbean, many of the Caribbean nations became independent, one of the first things they did was to give access to education. That is something that Eric Williams, Eugenia Charles, John Compton, and many of the first prime ministers of the Caribbean. So my area is generally the late 19th century. And when I look at education in that period, so just before 1900, the turn of the century, that the British government has almost no school set up in a place like St. Lucia. It is just churches and private individuals. The British government had no interest in addressing issues of people of non-white, or even education generally in the Caribbean, because there was no need to educate, because we were only providing labor on estates to send cheap raw products to Europe. And so you can count the number of schools, the number of children. I think the British government was given some subventions, but they were very nominal. And so I'm only talking about one of the things that they addressed, was really trying to explode the number of primary and secondary schools. Most people in outside of Jamaica, Trinidad, and Barbados could not receive a secondary education until about the late 1880s, the 1800s, sorry. So that is my response. I know you're asking directly about Trinidad and Tobago, I think. So I don't know. Yeah, so I'm just saying that's one. So they did recognize that.
That is the main vehicle, because that would be the only equitable vehicle that we could use to fight this, right? Because what you would have had, which we could not have gone into, you would have had persons who would have attempted also to see how they could use color and race as well. And so there are many articles written up to the 1950s about persons who might have, men who might have married women, you know, black educated men who might have married women who were white or colored, to be able to go up for social mobility in certain ways, right? But by the time we get to the Black Power Revolution, so that was actually the note my presentation ended on, right? The Black Power Revolution. By the time we get to the Black Power Revolution, you see that there's a pushback where that is concerned, okay? Because now it is felt as though, so we're independent, we have a measure of education. The society seems to continue, not the society, but the legacies in terms of how whites saw people of African descent and what was African continued. And so you had many people who were educated black people and Indian people who felt like they had to leave the country now to get good jobs, right? And so different segments of the society came together, and out of that would have come the Black Power Revolution, because it was still felt as though, whether it be the financial industry, banking industry, different industries, people who were white, and in the census they also call them, there was the white and I can't remember, there was a special term used, right, to encapsulate those persons who still identified as Portuguese, those who were Syrian Lebanese, right? It's not off-white, but there was another term that was used, right? There was European and there was this other group, right? And so what you found is that peaceful protest was also another way used, because when we look at the labor riots as well of the 1930s, right? Whereas our oil industry in Trinidad in particular begins to open, it's not being developed by locals. It is being developed by Canadians, South Africans, other Europeans. And so persons across the Caribbean, in Trinidad and across the Caribbean, begin to speak out. So you have a number of different ways that leaders, that persons on the ground are beginning to sort of assert themselves against a system that they felt really was oppressive. Education was one way, but maybe the main way, right? Because what education allowed you to do was to probably understand the position in the first place that you were in, because you had a lot of Caribbean intellectuals who went beyond just discussion, who went into actual changing laws, like Adrian Cola Rienzi, right? A number of different people who would come together to make changes for persons who before didn't stand a chance. And so for me, that is a very big deal, because as I said, if we were born 120 years ago, we stood very little chance, right, of being able to do what we are able to do now. So yeah, we still have a long way to go. But I think, in my humble opinion, I think we've come quite a long way. I will not compare us to other nations that have been independent for 200 years and more. I wouldn't do that, because, we're barely, right, 60. And so I think it's an unfair comparison, all right? We have a long way to go, but let us not discredit where we've come from. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause to Dr. Rajkumar and Dr. Joseph? So we are winding down effectively our program this afternoon. I do want to add, though, while we have certainly benefited from the historical perspective on our particular issues, I do believe that dealing with current issues would require a sociological perspective on the issue. So hopefully at next time around, we'll have both the sociologists as well as the historians to address these salient issues. Let me at this time invite Beverly.
Thank you so much. Thank you, students who actually came out. This is supposed to be a mandatory first-year seminar for first-year students. So for all the first years who came today, I want you to give your names to Mr. Philip, sitting on the side there, and I will ensure that I give him your name and your email address or telephone number, and we'll ensure that we have a little token for you for actually turning up, because we want you to continue as students to engage in critical thinking, and we want you to be exposed to more than what happens within the classroom. Because how many of you all here are history majors? 2 of you. And the rest of you? Nursing and other, right, psychology, right. And students, especially students in university, need to understand that you need to think beyond your particular discipline. So nurses, you need to think beyond nursing, right? And biology majors and psychology majors and even history majors. So that's why we have various seminars, etc. on campus, fireside chats, right, to support whatever you learn within the classroom, because we want you, as USians, to be able to dialogue on a diverse range of topics, right? We want you to be critical thinkers. So thank you so much for turning up today. I want you to give Dr. Roberts, for taking time out of his schedule to come and be our host for this afternoon's seminar. And of course, Drs. Joseph and Rajkumar, right? We thank them for taking time out of their valuable schedule to come and do this seminar for you. And of course, give yourselves a round of applause for showing up. Right, so thank you so much, and stay tuned for our next, what are we having next? Our next fireside chat would be on October 27th. So look out in your emails and around campus and on social media for the information. I think Dr. Roberts had something he wanted to advertise, so I'll hand the mic back over to him.
Yes, I just want to take the opportunity to mention to you, you should have seen it in your inbox, the School of Education and Humanities is relaunching the Dr. Shirley A. McGarrell Future Leaders Debate competition in honor of her recent passing. The president, Dr. Colwick Wilson, who I understand is or was online as the program went forward, is also partnering in this tribute with a special President's edition of the competition as he also celebrates USC's 95th anniversary. So I want you to go back in that inbox and seek to take part in this historic debate competition. And so with that, we bring our curtains down under the program. Though we didn't start with prayer, we certainly would like to take the opportunity to end with prayer. Let me invite you to stand and to assume a posture of prayer. Loving Father, we thank you for your grace. We thank you for your goodness towards us. We thank you that you are fully involved in the experience of humankind. Lord, we understand the challenges that sin has brought, the repercussions, especially to particular ethnicities, to particular groups, that notwithstanding, Lord, in all things, even the peoples that you had claimed in times past have gone through such challenges, and they have overcome in many ways. But more to it, Lord, we look forward to the day when none of the challenges that we continue to face, historic as well as current challenges, that they would be a thing of the past indeed. May we prepare ourselves even for your coming. Bless the students even as they engage with the work at hand, the work of education. And at the end, may we be always successful in all our endeavors. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, good evening, everyone.